Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode 11 of the Bible and Science. It's going to be a continuation of what we started last time, some common misconceptions, as well as a view of how science is actually supposed to work. And this would be the kind of thing that I taught in my science classes. So many people misunderstand what science actually is. So as a quick review, we dealt with some misconceptions in episode 10. First, creationists do not believe every species is exactly the same as when it was created. Second, evolution does not simply mean that species change over time. Evolution is change in the direction of increasing complexity. And creationists do believe in descent with modification. Adaptation to the environment, for instance, the giraffe's neck, is not the same as evolution, and features acquired through use and disuse of body parts are not passed on to offspring. The giraffe can stretch its neck all at once. The babies won't have any longer necks. And then we touched on supposedly the best example of evolution in the world today, the peppered moth. It has nothing to do with evolution. And we talked just a little bit about selective breeding, where you're trying to get cows that give more milk and beets that give more sugar. Selective breeding does not show how evolution could have happened. Evolution is supposed to be an unplanned process. Selective breeding is very carefully planned. So continuing on with misconceptions, here's another very common one. I would ask my students, what does your appendix do? And they would say nothing. No, this is a really common misconception. The human body contains many vestigial organs left over from the distant past. It's not true. Back in the late 1800s, somebody came up with a list of about 180 structures, and they said, this doesn't do anything. No, not true. A function is now known for almost every organ in the human body. If you just look at a bare skeleton, you'll see the coccyx, called the tailbone. It looks somewhat like a tail. But when the rest of the body is included, it has an obvious function. It's the anchoring point for the pelvic muscles. Besides that, we're supposed to be closely related to gorillas and chimps. They don't have tails. Why should we? And continuing on with the idea of vestigial organs, the tonsils and the appendix, which people think don't do anything, they certainly do. They both contain lymphoid tissue used in fighting infection, especially in infants. So in addition, the appendix is actually the reboot mechanism for your digestive system. It contains a supply of healthful bacteria of the kind you need in case you ever get a major infection and your intestinal bacteria get killed. You need the appendix to reboot. Now, I had my appendix out when I was a little kid, and so every time I have a major problem, I need to go take probiotics to get those bacteria back in there. Well, the appendix means you don't need to go take probiotics. And think about this. Our supposed lower mammal ancestors, they do have an appendix. And then moving up through the evolutionary chain, the monkeys, they do not have an appendix. And moving up more through the evolutionary chain, apes and humans do have an appendix. So what happened to the appendix? It had to be lost through random mutations and then regained much later through other random mutations. Well, you can live without an appendix. That is correct. You can live without an arm without an eye. You can live without one of your kidneys and so forth. That doesn't make it a vestigial organ. It's useful even though you can compensate for it. So the appendix is at the end of the alimentary canal, and the tonsils are at the beginning of the alimentary canal. They're both used to fight infection. Another common misconception, like other species, human embryos go through all the stages of evolutionary development before birth. A lot of this was popularized by Ernst Haeckel, a German doctor. He hated God. He wrote something like 40 books trying to persuade people to turn against God. So he was a professor of zoology at Jena University in Germany, and he produced drawings. He said, I've dissected embryos of various things at various stages of evolutionary development, and this is what they look like, and see how they're all going through similar evolutionary stages. That's from his 1874 book, Anthropogeny. The one on the right is supposed to be what the human embryo looks like. It's not. This is the real thing. Nowadays, we've got technology where we can sometimes do photos inside the womb, or after a baby dies, we get photos. These are from Wikimedia Commons. Dr. Ed Uthman furnished these. The bottom left is what a 7-week tubal pregnancy looks like. The middle one, an 8-week-old embryo, and the one at the upper right is a 9-week ectopic pregnancy. They don't look like what Haeckel said they did. He was lying. And this has been known to be a lie for well over 100 years, but still, this has never made it into a lot of biology textbooks, and a lot of people still believe this. It's just not true. So, tying in with that, the misconception is that human embryos go through all the stages of evolution. Well, when does a baby receive all of its genetic information? At the instant of conception. We talk about sex assigned at birth. No, it's sex assigned at conception. At the instant of conception, a baby receives all the genetic information it'll ever have. You can see some superficial similarities between different animals at different stages, but a competent embryologist can tell the difference at any stage from one-celled and onward. So what are called gill slits are neither gills nor slits. They're pouches from which the middle ears and a number of glands develop. What's called a yolk sac does not have any sort of yolk. It's the beginning supply of blood cells. So the parathyroid gland, carotid artery, and trachea, all of these have definite functions, even though they were supposed to be evolutionary vestiges in the late 1800s. Another common misconception, well, it's a good thing that people believe this, because otherwise they wouldn't be buying the superhero comic books. What do mutations cause? A mutation is a copying mistake during DNA duplication. Well, unless a mutation occurs in a reproductive cell, it will not be passed on to offspring. In some cases, a mutation may produce cancerous growths. In others, it may not have an obvious effect. But in early stages, a mutation in an embryo or an infant will be passed on to any cells that are descended from that cell. If it's in a homeotic gene, then it will almost always be harmful or fatal, because you need hearts, lungs, livers, and so forth. If there's a mutation in an allele of one of those variable genes that determine eye color, the amount of melanin in your skin, and so forth, that's probably going to be a recessive mutation, and it may have no visible effect, but it may also possibly appear in future generations. It was there, it was just hidden. Here's another one. I just saw this the other day. It's a common misconception. People say evolution is a law of science. This was in Academia Biology. It just came out in 2024 by Crouch and Bodmer. They said evolution by natural selection is a scientific law and not just a theory. Okay, I need some definitions here. I need a definition of evolution. If you just mean change, well, sure, things change. But remember, we've talked about this before. Evolution is not just change, but change in the direction of increasing complexity, from simple to complex. And then a scientific law, we're about to get into what a law is. A scientific law is something for which we've never seen a single exception. Have we ever seen a single exception where things did not evolve by natural selection? Sure, all the time. So the authors are using different definitions. They're redefining evolution, and they're redefining the word law. This is actually sort of similar to what Thomas Jefferson did. He wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Well, what did he mean by men? Jefferson obviously didn't believe that because Jefferson was a slave owner. He held slaves throughout his life, long after he wrote these magnificent words. So he justified owning slaves by redefining what do you mean by men? Well, it only included white property owners such as himself. So these guys are certainly not defining evolution in the same way we've been talking about, and they're not defining a law of science in the way we're about to get into. So I want you to be skeptical. This is one of the things I always told my students. You can ask questions about anything. I will never get mad if you challenge me if you ask a question. Because one of the most important characteristics of a scientist is skepticism. You should never accept anything just as it is. Most scientific progress does occur as we build on the work of others. But the great leaps forward usually happen because somebody doubts what everybody else said and thought. How many things in science are above question? Nothing. I got into a newspaper debate with a gentleman one time, and he said, evolution is as firmly established as gravity. Well, as we're going to see, there are multiple ideas about gravity. You can question gravity. It's perfectly okay. In fact, it's expected if you're really a good scientist. So let's go back to what we mean by scientific methods. First, you ask a question. You notice something in nature using your senses, and so you ask a question. Does music affect how plants grow? Why is the sky blue? Why is the grass green? And so forth. Then you gather information about the subject. You read what others have done before. Then you formulate a hypothesis. I think this is causing that. If this, then that. And then you devise some sort of experiment to test the hypothesis. You're going to be using logic. Then you observe the results of the test using your senses, maybe some measuring device, but ultimately you've got to examine it using your senses. And then you draw a conclusion. This is based on inductive logic, where you're looking for patterns. You report your results so others can repeat the test. And from that point on, others can use you as the authority for their work. So every year I required my students to do science experiments. They didn't like that. Oh no, I got to do that. Science depends on experiments. They're an attempt to determine cause and effect. So you've come up with a hypothesis and you decide, okay, what factor do I want to test? I think this is causing that. Yes, but I want to only change one factor that's called the independent variable. I want to see if there's then a change in a different factor, which is the dependent variable. So why is it called the independent variable? It doesn't depend on anything. It's you. It's you. You're so powerful. Your will is so powerful. You decide what do you want to examine. Okay, so it could be the amount of time that you observe for, environmental factors, whatever you want. So for example, if I want to know the effect of video games on heart rate, I want to make sure I keep all of the factors constant. What's the environment like, the temperature, what are they sitting on, are they thirsty, are they hot, or something like that. And then I would have the volunteers, as much as possible in ideal circumstances, identical circumstances, play video games to see if their heart rate changes. I'm trying to only change one thing, the independent variable, to see if the dependent variable depends on it. And when you're doing an experiment, you should use as many experimental subjects as possible, people, animals, or whatever, to make sure the results really depend on the independent variable, not just because of one person's unusual reaction. And then to make sure you're not overlooking something, you should also have a control group, for which you deliberately do not change the independent variable. And meanwhile, you watch that control group too, to see if the dependent variable changes. Guess what? There may be things going on in nature that you can't see. This is difficult to do electronically because of camera technology and so forth, but just to show you quickly. Suppose that you look at a candle. All you see is a bright area. Okay, you're trying to make sure you're not overlooking something. And this image just didn't come out very well because of processing problems. But once you've got your burning candle, is that all there is? No, there's a lot more to it. If you shine a bright light through the flame, and I encourage you to do this, you can't really see it on my picture, shine a very bright light through the flame, and whoa, what's that on the wall or on the screen? You can see shadows due to air currents. You couldn't detect those with just your eyes. Please try that. If you're a teacher, get your students to try that so they'll see that, oh, there's other stuff going on that I can't perceive with just my senses. My senses are not perfect. Yours are not. Our equipment is not perfect either. That's why we need a control, to make sure we're not overlooking something. So once we've got a control, we try to keep every other factor constant except the one that we're testing. For instance, if people are playing video games, make sure everybody gets the same amount of sleep, ate and drank the same things, etc. And then, if possible, you should repeat your experiments several times, especially if you only had a small number of experimental subjects. Then you draw conclusions about whether your hypothesis was confirmed or falsified, being as logical as you possibly can. And then you write a report. You don't just keep it to yourself. You want to enhance scientific knowledge for the human species. So you submit it for peer review. Peer review helps to reduce bias and prevent or correct mistakes. An honest scientist would never say something was absolutely proven. The only thing in science that's absolutely proven is that nothing in science is absolutely proven. There could always be something you overlooked. So, for instance, you're doing some experiment on why is the grass green, and you notice that your grass all died, but you had a control group and you had a non-control group, and it all died anyway. Maybe there was some other factor going on. Maybe the sun sent out a pulse of some sort of energy you were unaware of. So you can never say anything's proven. You would state whether your hypothesis was confirmed or falsified. And you'll see frequently honest scientists will frequently report the confidence level of their results instead of saying, I've proved this. So if the hypothesis was confirmed, then a scientist will publish a report in a peer-reviewed technical journal. Peers, same people who are in the same field as you. Chemists review the work of other chemists, astronomers of other astronomers, and so forth. And those on the review committee are looking to see if the experimenter made a mistake or overlooked something. So, there are some wonderful magazines out there with beautiful pictures and all, and they're not peer-reviewed. If you're really serious about your science, you need to go look in peer-review magazines. So if your work passes peer review at the technical journal, now the peers are going to write back to you saying, no, I think you overlooked this, I think you made a mistake there. So you get to defend your work, change it if necessary, or show them why, no, they're wrong and you're right. If your work passes peer review at the technical journal, then it's published. Other professional scientists from that point on are now going to be able to use your work as a reference to guide them in their own experiments. You now become the authority. So earlier I showed you a quote from two gentlemen who said that evolution by natural selection is a law. Well, okay, my dad used to be a law enforcement officer, and to get through a crowd, he'd say, make way for the law. Well, let's talk about the law. If a number of researchers have done experiments for an extended period of time, always gotten the same result, perhaps decades or longer, maybe centuries, and they've always gotten the same results, finally, the scientific community may begin to recognize their results as a scientific law. Laws of science have to do with what happens. things like gravity, thermodynamics, planetary motion, and so forth, these are derived from observation. If anybody ever sees an exception, the law must be corrected. For instance, for thousands of years, we would have said what goes up must come down. We've never seen an exception. But then, we shot up the first rocket and it didn't come down. Okay, it was close enough that you would correct the law. So you would say what goes up must come down unless it's traveling with sufficient velocity to overcome the attraction of the Earth. Now, there are other sorts of things that people thought were laws. For instance, the ancient Greeks thought everything was made of earth, air, fire, water, and the heavenly bodies were made of quintessence. No, that's not something that can be just tweaked a little bit. That was just flat out wrong. So you throw it out. But if there's just a minor variation, okay, then you correct it. Laws of science accurately predict the behavior of the systems they describe, and very often you can express a law of science mathematically. So what is a law of science? It's a description of what happens without trying to explain why it happens. For instance, the law of gravity given by that formula, it depends upon a gravitational constant upon the two masses attracting each other and the distance between centers squared. So that tells us how strong the force of gravity is. Why does gravity exist? We don't have a law about that. For that, we have theories. So a law of science tells us what happens, but then we have theories. This is a big mistake people make many times, saying evolution is only a theory. Christians, creationists will say, oh, evolution is only a theory. I don't call it that. In science, a theory is a very powerful term. It means that a hypothesis, an idea, has been tested over and over and over again. It's never failed a single test. So calling an idea a theory is a high compliment. The idea that humans came from apes is not a scientific theory. You can't test it. What do you mean it hasn't failed a test? It hasn't passed a test. It's impossible to test. There's no way you could perform an experiment to make apes evolve into humans. Instead, there are other terms we use for that, hypothesis or model. Doesn't mean they're wrong, but you can't call it a theory. So likewise, the idea of a Big Bang is not testable. It relies upon computer models rather than experimentation. We can't go back to the beginning and make something explode and produce a universe. No, we have a hypothesis or a model rather than theory. Of course, the TV show The Big Bang Theory doesn't sound quite as good when you call it the Big Bang model. So the way scientific ideas progress, in science, the word theory is not used the same way it is in ordinary conversation, where we often mean it's just a guess. Okay, if we have a description of what happens, then we start as a hypothesis and we test it to see if this is really what happens. Well, we may go the other way. We may be trying to explain why something happens. That also starts as a hypothesis, but then we test either one by experimentation. If a hypothesis is supported by repeated experiments over lengthy periods of time, and it never fails a test, eventually we'll recognize it may be a scientific law if it says what happens, or it may be a scientific theory if it says why it happens. But if it ever fails even a single test, it has to be modified or discarded. Now, there's one thing most people just don't think about. If you have a valid scientific theory, it has to be able to be falsified. There's only one law of gravity. The equation I showed you before, the force of gravity is given by this equation. We use that to predict how strong gravity is. So why does gravity exist? There are several proposed explanations, that is, theories, as to why it exists. One of the theories of gravity says that there are particles called gravitons moving between objects. Another says that there are gravity waves. Another says that space is distorted by the presence of matter. And there also could be others that we haven't thought of, but those three have been tested. They may not have passed the test, but they haven't failed the test either. So we should be able to envision a test that if it fails, we'll say, oh, no, I was wrong. If it's failed, it shows a theory is wrong. That is, a theory at least has the potential to be falsified. All three of the above do qualify as theories because scientists are trying to test them. They may not succeed, but they're trying. So, for instance, we have something called cell theory, which says, among other things, that all living things are made of cells. If we could ever come up with one living thing that's not made of cells, we'd have to say, oops, cell theory is falsified. That's never happened, but at least there's the potential it could be falsified. So what are we going to do? We can't prove things, we can't test things, we have laws to describe what happens, we have theories to try to explain what happens, explain why it happens. So do we give up? No, no. There was a famous poem by John Sachs, The Blind Men of Hindustan. He talks about how some blind men went into the jungles and they encountered an elephant. So the first one bumped into the side. He said, oh, an elephant is like a wall. Another one bumped into the leg. He said, an elephant is like a tree. Another one bumped into the ear. He said, an elephant is like a fan. Another one bumped into the tail. He said, an elephant is like a rope. Another one bumped into the trunk. He said, oh, an elephant is like a finger or something, or a snake. Well, were they all right? None of them was completely right. Were they all wrong? No, none of them was completely wrong either. So if you put together your ideas, you can formulate a scientific model. It doesn't have the same confidence level as a law or a theory, but it's very useful. For instance, when we talk about the planetary model of the atom, nobody believes an atom is like what's typically been drawn, a little nucleus and then the electrons orbiting around like planets, but it's very useful. A model is used to help us get a mental picture of something that we can't directly observe because either it's too fast or too slow, can be too big, the whole universe, or too small, the details of the smallest particles. It can be too far away where we can't see it. It can be something from the past. It can be something that's supposed to happen in the future. All of those things we don't have to give up on studying, but we can't say we have a law. We can't even say we have a theory. We use a model to help sort of wrap our minds around an idea. There are many, many, many things that are models. For instance, creation is not a theory. It's not a law. It's several different models. You have old Earth creation, you have young Earth creation. Likewise, evolution. You can't test it. It's not a law. There are various models of evolution. One says that it's been a slow, steady, gradual process. Another one says it happens in sudden jumps. So they're both models. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. It doesn't mean they're right. They're still useful. You can use models to investigate things that you may not be able to get all of the details of, but you can still attempt using a model to get a better understanding. So going back to summarize, a hypothesis, that's your tentative explanation for something observed in nature. If this, then that. A theory is a hypothesis that's been thoroughly tested by many, many, many experiments and has never failed a test. It's an attempt to explain why something happens. A law has also been tested by many, many, many experiments, usually for many years. It describes what happens without trying to say why it happens. So if you can't do that, you don't give up. You put a model. You say a model, it's a description, an object, or a drawing, or even a set of equations, which is frequently done in physics. It helps us to get a mental picture of something we cannot directly observe. So, as I said, that article that said evolution is a law of science, these guys would not do very well in my science classes. A law says what happens, it's been tested. A theory says why it happens, it's been tested. A model may not necessarily have been tested, but it's useful. So let me try to summarize again. In science, we talk about empirical, that is, having to do with observation. So empirical science is determined by observation and experimentation. This would be, more than anything else, the physical sciences like physics, chemistry, and biology to a certain extent. These things deal with phenomena that are repeatable, observable, and testable. We also talk about historical science. These are our ideas about what might have happened in the past. This is an attempt to find the most reasonable explanation, but it cannot be observed, repeated, or tested. This is not the same type of science as empirical science. So when we're dealing with the question of evolution, that is not empirical science, that's historical science. Cosmology, likewise, we can't tell what happened at the beginning of the Big Bang. We can't test it. Historical geology, is it really true that the present is the key to the past, that everything has always happened at the same rate? Can we really test the age of the Earth? No, those are examples of the historical sciences. So where did all of these equations that we use in science, especially physics and chemistry and so forth, come from? Following the scientific method, someone became curious about nature and they asked a question. They did research to find out what others had done before. They formulated a hypothesis, devised experiments to test it. They observed the results of the tests over and over to make sure they had valid data. They analyzed the data to look for patterns, and then continuing on with the scientific methodology, they would use inductive logic to draw conclusions about the most likely explanation. People would not say they had proven anything, but in many cases they expressed the conclusions in the form of equations. Then they would report their results so that others could repeat their experiments and confirm or falsify their conclusions. You can go out and look up the things that were done by some of the great scientists in the past. They published. And then finally, after many years of testing, the scientific community would recognize the conclusions as laws of nature. If they were equations, that's how we express them. For instance, the law of gravity. So since they were tested thoroughly, that's why we use them. So we've been speaking a great deal about the sciences, about testing and so forth. But remember, this is called the Bible and Science. So the next time we're going to be dealing more about the Bible again. We're going to talk about why the origins controversy has to do with the Bible and science and why it's important to each of us. So be back later.